It's really good to be here with you today. As Colin said, or implied, I began my career in the development education sector as part of the Latin America Solidarity Centre. And speaking with Frank earlier, I defined it that way. Whereas now in Friends of the Earth, on a day-to-day basis, I don't see myself as being in the development education sector, weirdly, even though the techniques, the orientation, the way of seeing the world and the way of engaging with people to help them see the world and to act in the world are very much informed and shaped by development education principles and practices. And weirdly, I think the only difference is that back then, Latin America Centre was principally funded by DevEd funding, and Friends of the Earth isn't. In fact, both organisations see themselves as solidarity organisations, as campaigning organisations, as educational organisations. And Friends of the Earth is as much about DevEd now as Latin America Centre was then, and Latin America Centre was as much about campaigning and change then as Friends of the Earth is now. So it's a funny mental division that's been in my career, but actually isn't in my practice or in the practice of the organisations that I've had the privilege of leading. I was going to start just by echoing Frank, who seems to have had some of the same cultural milestones as me, but by talking about a few of the stories that have impacted on me and my journey of wanting to make change in the world. And many of them, because I think stories are, as Colin has been alluding to, are often more powerful when they're centred on an individual than when they're centred on the mass or the atmosphere or the planet. It's the stories of people that get us. So when I was in fourth year, the year that Beth is just finishing, two people and their stories impacted on me. One was Sheila Cassidy, who was a British doctor who was in Chile at the time of the Pinochet coup in 1973 and wrote a book about her experience of torture and survival and campaigning around Chilean human rights and against Pinochet and the coup called Audacity to Believe. And we read it as part of, we didn't have transition year in those days as such, but we didn't do much work either. And in our religion class, we explored this book. She had a religious motivation to her work, but the story was much broader. And as it happened in that year, Chile was having a referendum, a yes or no referendum on whether or not Pinochet should continue in office or not. So that was a story of change, of resilience, of oppression and of change that really struck me. The second thing that happened that year was a man called Colin Roddy came in to speak to our classes about what was called Campaign Aid, which was a campaign for Ireland, this will sound familiar, to give 0.7% of its gross national income in overseas aid. At the time, Ireland was giving 0.16 of our national income in overseas aid, and we have that story is a long and winding road. As some of you know, I've been very involved in it along the way, and it was about and remains about putting our money where our mouth is. We are good storytellers in Ireland, and our story has included our relationship with Africa, the missionaries, and our relationship of solidarity with Sandinistas and Nicaragua in the days when they were good, and against human rights abuses. So, but there was a gap between how we spoke, how we saw ourselves, how we spoke about ourselves, and how we actually acted in terms of our money, our government's money, our money through our government. Our people have always been hugely generous. And campaign aid was then, and the issues around 0.7 now remain about closing that gap. So those two stories struck me very strongly then. Two more briefly. One was a bus driver from Clondalkin called Tom Hyland, who saw a documentary about a massacre in a graveyard in East Timor in 1991 and said, I've got to do something about that. And within 4 or 5 years changed Irish government policy on East Timor for Ireland to become a leading advocate in Europe for East Timorese independence. And what's interesting about that is that Ireland rarely takes lead positions on these issues. We tend to be more of a follower. And actually, during that period when I was in LASK, a senior official in the Department of Foreign Affairs said, in the context of EU policy generally, we tend to see which way things are going, and we will jump when we know we'll be jumping into the majority to make a decision. When a decision's going this way, we won't be the pioneers who get shot. We're the settlers who are part of the winning majority. That bit's my interpretation of what he said. And in the case of Tom Hyland, who hadn't been through much formal education of any sort and hadn't been through a DevEd course, he just saw an injustice and said, I'm going to change this. And changed Irish government policy. They became a leader, and that was pivotal in a way that the civil servant hadn't foreseen, of changing European policy and changing world policy around East Timor. And obviously it wasn't his struggle alone, but he is a hero in East Timor for his contribution to their independence struggle. And finally, the story of Marciana Funes, who was a fruit and vegetable seller in Belize, who one of the places she sold her fruit and vegetables was a place called Cow Pen, where most of the people were migrants, or immigrants rather than migrants, who worked in the banana industry. And she saw there the injustices they were suffering at the hands of the farm owners, all of whom supplied their bananas to Fifes for export. And she said this wasn't good enough. And she managed to make contact to Ireland, and she led the AFRI walk in 1996. And the outflow of that through solidarity between Latin America Centre and Trocra and AFRI was that Marina and I, who works for IDEA, spent 2 years living and working in Belize, accompanying them on their journey for land rights, which was successful, and labour rights, which was more of a tortured road. So I don't know what to draw from those stories, really, except that they don't follow a linear, logical pattern of awareness, education, skills, and action. And I say that because when I learned about DevEd, which is a long time ago, but looking at the IDEA model that is validated by DFA and Irish Aid, it suggests, it doesn't say that this is rigid, it suggests that it's a process of knowledge and understanding and awareness, an educational process that then, strengthens your values and builds on your values, and then builds your skills, and then promotes action. That action comes at the end. And my experience is much messier than that, and I think the experience of the strikes, which Beth will talk about, is instructive in this regard as well. And that sometimes, awareness comes for sure, but action follows awareness before skills and before a huge understanding and knowledge, and that those things are built through practice, through engaging with the world, and not in a confined, supported space, but in the real world in real time. And that's something we need to think about in our practice of DevEd. And also, climate change is a disruptor, and in my experience, the strikes we'll hear about, it's a disruptor and a challenger to the NGO way of doing business, and both in the real world, as in real people's lives, and in education. So when I moved from Christian Aid to Friends of the Earth, I began looking for allies around climate change. Climate change was our task, and I realised very quickly that we weren't going to manage this on our own in Friends of the Earth. The environmental sector at the time in particular was much weaker than the overseas aid sector that I'd come from. And so we began a dialogue with the likes of Concern and Trocra and others. And early in 2006, I think I was in Trocra as they were thinking about climate change. And they were saying, and this made absolute sense at the time, we're seeing the impacts of climate change in our programs with our partners, but it's not something separate. It's a phenomenon that is aggravating the existing risk and the existing vulnerability. And it isn't what they talk about on the ground, but we're seeing it and we're incorporating it into our livelihoods programs and our resilience programs. And I know Concerned that at that time we're doing work in disaster risk reduction and mitigation that involved climate change. But it's amazing how fast that changed, where climate change became much more central and much more talked about by people on the ground, by the partners that we work with on the ground, as a central reality of their lived experience, and as a threat to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, undermining the gains that we've been seeing through development. So it has disrupted, climate change has disrupted the way actual development and the way we as NGOs do development with our partners because of its destructive impact. But I think it's also now disrupting how we do education and how we do engagement and practice as well. So Friends of the Earth, kind of building on that same logic, we engaged with those NGOs about forming a coalition. And I'll say one thing in a second. One of the things that drove me in doing that was that when I left Christian Aid, Ireland was the 6th most generous country in the world per person in ODA, an official development assistance, among the members of the OECD that are members of the Development Assistance Committee. And I went then to Friends of the Earth and I started looking at climate pollution. I did the calculations, which hadn't really been done before, and discovered we were also the 6th most polluting country in the world per head of population among that same peer group of DAC members of the OECD. And this seemed to me to be two contradictory stories, that what we were telling ourselves about our generosity of overseas aid completely conflicted with what we were doing with our emissions in Ireland, given that climate change was becoming more and more of an issue for development. And sort of my story of change has been trying to get the Irish public to see that contradiction and to act in coherence. And obviously, obvious allies in that were the overseas aid agencies and other solidarity agencies. And together we formed the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition in 2007. And it involved overseas aid agencies, it involved youth and faith groups, but the youth groups, at the time, it was basically the National Youth Council. So it was the NGOs who were, represented these various sectors. Some grassroots groups, although not grassroots young groups. And we mobilised people, we did photo opportunities, we looked for media, we got some traction, we met some politicians, we did some campaigning, but it was pretty traditional. And we thought we were doing innovative things, but it was relatively traditional. What's happened in the last 5 years, even before the strikes, has really, in a positive way, disrupted that business as usual, to borrow a phrase, way of going about campaigning and public engagement, as much as Dev Ed in that case, because we had a slogan back then. We had a photo of Bertie Ahern standing in up to his oxters in water in North Dublin in 2003, I think it was, saying, and we put on top of it on our first postcard, when we still use postcards as for campaigning, let's not wait till climate change hits home. Of course, we did wait until climate change hits home, and so that's changed the dynamic of how people relate to the issue. It isn't just a story of polar bears or people in Africa. Both the causes and consequences of climate change are now hitting us here in Ireland. And the causes first, I think, in a way. So what I've seen change my movement, so to speak, the climate change movement that I'm involved in, have been 3 waves of activism that have been a shot in the arm and a challenge in a positive way. The anti-fracking movement, the movement to ban the hydraulic fracturing of shale rock under our feet to get gas out, which was led not by environmentalists, not by climate change activists, but by communities in Leitrim who didn't want their tourism and their farming and their communities turned into an industrial zone to do fracking. And they were much more powerful at convincing politicians. Those stories were much more resonant with politicians than stories either of evidence-based environmental impact or of far away impact of climate change. And within 2 years, fracking was outlawed in Ireland, one of the first countries in the world to do so. Then came a wave of student activism in universities who said, I don't want my college's money invested in fossil fuels. So third level students in Trinity, in Galway, in NUI Maynooth, in UCD drove campaigns that divested those colleges of fossil fuels, and then they joined the fracking movement, and then they joined the movement for the Irish government to do more. If we have divested, so should the Irish government, and Trócaire led a campaign for the Irish government to divest its sovereign wealth fund, all of which is successful partly because the way the Dáil has changed and the government hasn't got a majority. And I used to joke, even before the school strikes, that the students from the colleges were kind of like the cavalry, but then I would be cautious about that because it's putting a lot of responsibility on them. And then the final story is Greta and the school strikes. And Greta is a symbol now, as opposed to, there are a lot of people, one of whom we're going to hear from. But a bit like David Attenborough and the strike and plastics, it wasn't that there wasn't concern about plastics, it wasn't that there wasn't frustration, it was that he gave us permission suddenly to be angry about it and to do things about plastic. But something in the world and the power of stories, one girl, and she is a girl rather than a woman, 15 years of age at the time, who went outside her parliament in Sweden in last August, and now 2 million people on the streets in the last few months protesting about climate change and demanding their government do more with a clarity and a power that certainly we haven't managed as our climate movement in the last 12 years, that has transformed politicians' rhetorical reaction, not yet their actual action. What's made it break through? It's a fascinating question. It's remarkable to be part of. And I think, but it also challenges that model I spoke about, because for sure, I don't think Greta went to a development education course before she acted. She knew, she was aware of this challenge, and she felt, this is my future, this is my life. It's not about someone far away and remote. I think that's changed too. When I started DevEd, it was about looking for Irish people who weren't directly affected by these issues to take responsibility for something far away that should be made better, and the connectedness. Weirdly, now we're finding, my worry at least, is that these young people are taking too much responsibility. They're feeling it too much. They're feeling too responsible. And actually, the spaces that we have to create for them now after their actions are how do you sustain yourselves, how do you sustain your movement, how do you now explore after your awareness and action, how do you skill up more, how do you make sure you're not the only one carrying the burdens of leadership in your movement and being the only ones doing interviews or conferences or whatever else, and how do you now deepen your understanding and awareness of the issues and be beyond the leadership cadre that is there throughout those 10,000 people who went in those marches, or 15,000. And I think that's a huge opportunity for the next 15 years and the next 15 months for those of us who see ourselves as development educators. But it's also a huge challenge to our ways of doing Dev Ed, and indeed probably the ways of funding Dev Ed. And I think it's something that I look forward to exploring with you over the course of this conference and beyond. Thanks very much.